The mist was a shroud, clinging to the black-boned pines and swallowing the morning whole. For 20 years, Thaddeus Crane had learned its language, the way it muted sound and deadened the world, and he had made it his own. His cabin, a thing of hewn logs gone gray with time and sorrow, was less a home than a tomb he had built for a man who was still breathing. Each day began with the same ritual, a catechism of solitude, the scrape of the iron kettle on the stove, the slow pour of water over grounds, the first bitter sip of coffee that tasted of ash and memory. The world outside his small, grimy window was a watercolor of muted greens and browns, a landscape he had memorized until it was etched onto the inside of his eyelids. He moved through his chores with the economy of a ghost, his footfalls on the packed dirt floor making no more sound than the fall of a pine needle. The silence was his companion, his penance, and his shield. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on him, reminding him of all the words he'd failed to say, and the one scream he could never unhear. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, bone, sinew, and a guilt so vast it had its own geography. His hands, once capable of gentle things, were now calloused and foreign, tools for chopping wood and setting snares, never for holding another. He hadn't felt the touch of another human being in 2 decades. The thought of it was a phantom limb, an ache for something he'd amputated himself. He punished himself with this isolation, with the cold seeping into his bones, with the slow, grinding erosion of his own humanity. He was serving a life sentence for a crime only he remembered, the death of his wife, Sarah. He had failed to protect her, and the mountain was his cell. This morning, the mist was thicker than usual, a cold, wet wool that promised a day of unbroken gray. He pulled on his worn leather boots, the laces a familiar, mindless task. He needed to check the snares along the eastern ridge. He moved out of the cabin, the damp air a slap to his face. The world was a symphony of quiet sounds he knew intimately. The drip of condensation from a fir bough, the distant caw of a raven, the whisper of wind through the high peaks, and then another sound, a soft, rhythmic creak. It was wrong. It didn't belong to the forest's lexicon. It was the sound of strain, of weight against wood, of something man-made and suffering. He followed it, his body tensing, every instinct honed by 20 years of solitude, screaming that this was an intrusion, a violation. The sound led him toward the ancient oak that stood alone in a small clearing 100 yards from his cabin. It was his place of judgment, the spot where he would stand and stare at the valley below, reminding himself of the world he had forsaken. The tree was a gnarled crossroads, a silent witness to his unraveling. As he drew closer, the shape hanging from its thickest limb resolved from a blur in the mist into a horror, a person tied to the oak. His heart, a dormant, stony thing, gave a painful lurch. He stopped, concealed behind a cluster of ferns, the wet leaves cold against his face. It was a woman. Her head was slumped forward, a curtain of dark hair obscuring her face. Her clothes were torn, and a dark stain, almost black in the flat light, was spreading across her side. Her hands were bound to the tree trunk above her head, the ropes digging cruelly into her wrists. He could see the faint, shuddering rise and fall of her back. She was alive. Every fiber of his being, every lesson learned in 2 decades of self-imposed exile, screamed at him. "Walk away! This is not your concern. This is the world's poison, and you are clean of it. To interfere is to connect. To connect is to risk is to fail." The ghost of Sarah whispered in his ear, a cold breath of memory. "You couldn't save me. What makes you think you can save her?" He began to back away, the crunch of a twig under his boot unnaturally loud in the charged silence. He would go back to his cabin, bolt the door, and let the forest reclaim what had been left in it. It was the law of the wild, and he was more wild now than man. But then she moved. Her head lifted, a gesture of immense effort. She coughed, a wet, ragged sound that tore through the mist, and for a fleeting second, her eyes, hazy with pain, seemed to find his hiding place. He saw not a plea for help, but a flicker of something else. Defiance. A stubborn, burning ember of will in a body that was close to extinguished. That flicker was a hook. It snagged on something deep inside him, a part of his soul he thought had long since turned to dust. It was hope. Not for herself, perhaps, but the simple animal hope of drawing one more breath. He saw his wife's face in that flicker, not her death, but her life, the fierce, vibrant light he had loved. He had spent 20 years running from that memory, from the pain of that connection. Now it was the only thing holding him in place. His feet, which had been ready to carry him back to his prison, felt rooted to the damp earth. The silence he had cultivated for so long was suddenly unbearable, filled with the sound of his own cowardice. He could walk away and live another day in his gray, hollow world. Or he could step forward and risk shattering it completely. The oak tree stood as it always had, a place of judgment. And Thaddeus Crane, the hermit, the ghost of the mountain, was on trial. He watched her exhale, a small cloud of steam in the cold air, a fragile flag of life, and he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that he could not let it be her last. The decision, once made, settled in his stomach like a hot stone. The fear was still there, a coiling serpent, but it was joined by a current of something else, something sharp and unfamiliar. Purpose. He straightened from his crouch, the movement feeling stiff, monumental. As he stepped into the clearing, the woman's head snapped up. Fear widened her eyes, raw and immediate. He saw her brace herself, her body tensing against the ropes. She thought he was one of them, the ones who had left her here. "I'm not with them," he said. His voice was a ruin, a rasp of rust and disuse. The words felt alien on his tongue. He approached slowly, holding his hands out, palms open to show he was unarmed. The gesture was for her, but it was also for himself, a reminder that these hands were not weapons. He carried a small skinning knife on his belt, a tool of his solitary trade. He drew it now, the worn leather of the sheath whispering as the blade came free. The woman flinched, a small guttural sound of terror escaping her lips. "The ropes," he croaked, gesturing with the knife. "Only the ropes." He moved behind the tree, his proximity to her a violation of the sanctum he had built around himself for 2 decades. He could smell the metallic tang of her blood, the sweat of fear, the simple, overwhelming scent of another human being. It was intoxicating and repellent. He reached up, the cold steel of the blade pressing against the thick hemp. He had to steady his hand, the fine tremor in his fingers betraying a nervous system overloaded with sensation. As the first rope gave way with a sharp snap, her body sagged, her full weight slumping against the remaining bond. He worked faster, sawing at the second rope. When it parted, she collapsed. He reacted without thinking. His arms shot out, catching her before she hit the ground. And then it happened. Human touch. It was not a memory or a phantom ache. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock, an electric current that sizzled up his arms and exploded in his chest. Her skin, though cold and clammy, was impossibly soft against his calloused hands. The slight weight of her in his arms was a cataclysm. For a split second the world went white behind his eyes, and he was 20 years in the past, holding Sarah, her laughter echoing in a sun-drenched field. The memory was so vivid, so violent, it almost made him drop the woman in his arms. He gasped, stumbling back a step, his carefully constructed walls of isolation turning to sand. The woman groaned, the sound pulling him back to the misty clearing, to the bleeding stranger and the severed ropes. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep with pain, but lucid. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the mist, the distant, unmistakable crack of a twig, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. They were coming back. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. His first instinct, the one honed by years of avoidance, was to flee, to melt back into the woods and leave her. But he couldn't. He had touched her. He had caught her. The act had forged a link, however fragile, and the thought of breaking it now felt like a second, deeper betrayal. He looked down at her. She was trying to push herself up, her face a mask of grim determination. That flicker of defiance was still there. "Can you walk?" he asked, the words coming out harsher than he intended. She nodded, biting her lip against a wave of pain as she put weight on her feet. "I think so. My horse. They took my horse." "There's no time," he said, his gaze darting toward the sound of the approaching men. "This way. Quickly." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed her arm, the contact another jolt, but this time it was different. Less shock, more urgency. He pulled her after him, away from the clearing, plunging into the dense, untracked wilderness that was his domain. The forest that had been his sanctuary now became their shield. He moved with a silent, preternatural swiftness, his feet finding paths that weren't there, his body weaving through the tangled undergrowth as if he were part of it. He could hear the men behind them, their movements clumsy, their curses loud in the quiet woods. They were hounds, but they were in his territory. He pulled her along, her breathing growing more ragged. The stain on her side was spreading. He knew he had to find a place to hide, a place to tend to her wound. He led her toward a rocky outcrop, a jumble of granite boulders and fallen logs that formed a shallow cave, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He pushed aside a thick curtain of moss-draped branches and guided her inside. The space was cramped and smelled of damp earth and stone. It was barely enough for the two of them. "Stay here. Don't make a sound," he whispered, his face inches from hers. He could see the exhaustion warring with fear in her eyes. He slipped back out, moving like a shadow to a vantage point where he could watch their pursuers. Two men emerged into the clearing with the oak tree. They were rough, bearded men, their faces hard with casual cruelty. One of them kicked at the severed ropes on the ground. "She's gone," the man spat. "Hayes ain't gonna like this." "She can't have gotten far, not hurt like she was," the other said, scanning the trees. "Must have had help. Spread out, find her, and find whoever cut her loose." The name, Hayes, landed in Thaddeus's gut like a punch from a ghost. Clayton Hayes. The name was a brand on his soul, the architect of his ruin, the man who had destroyed his life, who had murdered Sarah. 20 years. 20 years he had lived with the specter of that name, and now it had followed him up his mountain. The world he had run from had found him. It wasn't a random act of violence that had brought this woman to his tree. It was a ghost from his own past. The men fanned out, their voices receding as they began their search. Thaddeus slid back into the cave, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, rising dread that was chillingly familiar. He turned to the woman. She had slumped against the rock wall, her eyes closed, her face pale. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her wounded side. He had to see how bad it was. "I need to look at the wound," he said, his voice low. She nodded weakly, not opening her eyes. With fumbling, unpracticed fingers, he gently tore the fabric of her shirt wider. The wound was a deep, ragged gash, oozing blood, a knife wound. It was dirty, but hadn't hit anything vital, as far as he could tell. He was no doctor, but he knew how to stitch a cut from his own mishaps. He had a small kit in the cabin, needle, sinew thread, and a flask of potent homemade whiskey for sterilizing. "It needs cleaning, stitches," he said. "My cabin is close, but we have to wait until they're gone." She finally opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Her gaze was intelligent, searching. "They work for Clayton Hayes," she said. It wasn't a question. Thaddeus froze. "How do you know that name?" "Because I'm hunting him," she replied, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "My name isn't Harper. That's the name I was using. It's Eleanor Blackwood." The second name hit him as hard as the first. Judge Marcus Blackwood. He was the law in the valley 20 years ago, a hard but fair man who had been building a case against Hayes and his gang for rustling, extortion, and murder. Hayes had killed him. It had been the talk of the territories, a brazen act of violence that cemented Hayes's reputation as a man beyond the reach of the law. Judge Blackwood's daughter, Thaddeus breathed, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. You were using yourself as bait. It worked, she said, a grimace of pain crossing her face. I let it be known I had my father's old files, that I was looking for someone who could corroborate his evidence. I knew Hayes would come for me. I just didn't expect him to be so thorough. She gestured vaguely to her wound. A silence fell between them, thick with the weight of shared history, of a common enemy. The forest outside was quiet again. The hunters had moved on, for now. But they would be back. Thaddeus looked at this woman, this Eleanor Blackwood, and saw not a victim, but a warrior. Her strength, her sheer, reckless determination, was a stark contrast to his 2 decades of passive suffering. He had run from Hayes. She had run toward him. Then, she delivered the final, devastating blow. She must have seen the haunted look in his eyes, the deep, ancient guilt he wore like a second skin. My father wasn't the only one Hayes was worried about, she said softly, her eyes holding his. In his files there were notes about a woman who had stumbled onto his ledgers. She was going to bring them to my father. Her name was Sarah. Thaddeus felt the world tilt on its axis. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. What? Hayes killed her to get those ledgers, Eleanor continued, her voice gentle but relentless. He ambushed her on the road to town. It wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. She was a threat to him. He killed her because she was brave. The story Thaddeus had told himself for 7,300 days fell to pieces. The narrative of his failure, the bedrock of his guilt, crumbled into dust. He hadn't failed to protect Sarah from a random act of evil. He hadn't been too slow, too weak. She hadn't died because he wasn't there. She had died because she was doing something heroic, something he never even knew about. She had been fighting the same monster Eleanor was fighting now. The guilt that had defined him, that had been the very architecture of his soul, was a lie. He had imprisoned himself for a crime he didn't commit. For 20 years, he had been mourning his own failure, when he should have been honoring her courage. He looked at Eleanor, her face pale in the gloom of the cave, and saw not an intrusion, but a reckoning. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It had just found him, here in the deep woods, and it was demanding that he finally face it. The weight in his chest didn't disappear, but it changed. The cold, heavy stone of guilt began to transform, to heat, to glow with the embers of a rage he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 2 decades. It was a rage not for what he had lost, but for what had been stolen. And with it, a new, terrifying purpose began to form. Justice. The revelation settled not like a peace, but like a tremor that shakes a mountain to its foundation. The narrative that had sustained Thaddeus Crane for half his life, the story of his guilt, his failure, his deserved punishment, was gone. In its place was a gaping void, and into that void rushed 20 years of suppressed rage and a bewildering sense of stolen time. He had been a ghost, haunting the scene of the wrong crime. Sarah hadn't been a victim of his weakness. She had been a casualty of her own strength. The thought was both a liberation and an indictment. He had hidden from the world while she had tried to save a piece of it. He stared at Eleanor, the daughter of the man Sarah had been trying to reach, and felt the invisible threads of the past drawing tight around them. This was not a coincidence. This was an echo, a debt coming due. The ledgers, he said, his voice a low growl. Where are they? I don't have them, Eleanor admitted, her voice strained. They were in my saddle pack, along with my father's files, the proof. That's what Hayes was after. He has it all now. The saddle pack, the container of truth. Thaddeus's gaze sharpened. The men had taken her horse. Hayes would have the pack. He would likely destroy the evidence as soon as he had it in his hands. Time was running out. We have to get you back to my cabin, he stated, his tone shifting from that of a reluctant savior to a man with a mission. I can't stitch you up out here, and we need a plan. They waited in the cramped silence of the cave, listening to the sounds of the forest reasserting itself. The calls of birds returned, the wind soughed through the pines. The hunters were gone for now, their search moving further down the ridge. Thaddeus knew their patterns. They would sweep the area and, finding nothing, would likely return to their camp to report to Hayes. That was their window. When he was certain it was safe, he helped Eleanor to her feet. She leaned on him heavily, her face ashen. The short, desperate flight through the woods had taken its toll. The journey back to his cabin was slow and agonizing. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain through her, and every time she stumbled, he caught her, the physical contact no longer a shock, but a grim necessity. He was acutely aware of her fragility, of the warmth of her body against his, a stark reminder of the life that was in his hands. It was a responsibility he had spent 20 years avoiding, and now it felt like the only thing that mattered. The cabin, when they finally reached it, looked different to him. It was no longer his tomb, his sanctuary of solitude. Seen through the lens of their new reality, it was a hovel, small, dark, and grim. A place to hide, not to live. He settled Eleanor on his cot, the only soft surface in the entire structure. It was a miserable bed of straw ticking and a single threadbare blanket, but she sank into it with a grateful sigh. He moved with a newfound urgency, his old rituals replaced by the pressing needs of the present. He stoked the fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He filled the kettle with water and set it to boil. From a small, dust-covered chest, he retrieved his medical supplies, a curved needle, a spool of deer sinew, a bottle of clear, fiercely potent moonshine, and clean rags he tore from one of his few spare shirts. "This will burn," he warned, uncorking the bottle. The sharp scent of alcohol filled the small space. Eleanor just nodded, her jaw set. He knelt beside the cot and gently, methodically, cleaned the gash. She hissed in pain, her fingers clenching the blanket, but she didn't cry out. He admired her grit, a quiet, steely core of strength that shamed his own long retreat from the world. As he worked, his hands clumsy but steady, he felt the last vestiges of his self-pity burn away in the clean fire of her resolve. He was a man who had been defined by an ending. She was a woman fighting for a new beginning. Stitching the wound was a slow, meticulous process. The needle pierced her skin again and again, and with each stitch, he felt as if he were mending something within himself, pulling together the torn edges of his own broken purpose. He worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Eleanor's controlled breathing. When he was done, he bandaged the wound tightly with the clean rags. "Thank you," she said, her voice weary but firm. "You're surprisingly good at that." "You learn what you have to when you're alone," he replied, the words tasting of ashes. Alone. The word now sounded like a failure, not a choice. He gave her a tin cup of water, and she drank it greedily. Color was slowly returning to her face. He sat on the single stool across the small room, the firelight flickering between them. The full weight of their situation settled in the quiet space. "Hayes won't stop," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "He has the papers. He'll think he's won. But he'll also know someone helped me. He'll hunt you too." "Let him," Thaddeus said, the words coming from a place of cold certainty. The fear was gone, calcified into something harder, more dangerous. "He has something I want." "The pack," she breathed. "You want to go back for it." "He stole more than your father's files," Thaddeus said, his voice low and intense. "He stole my wife's memory. He let me believe she died for nothing, that I was nothing. I won't let that stand. We get the pack, we get the truth, and we make him pay." A flicker of hope ignited in Eleanor's eyes, mixing with a deep-seated caution. "His camp will be guarded. We saw 2 of his men. There will be more. Trying to take it by force. It's suicide." "I know," Thaddeus agreed. For 20 years his world had been this mountain. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its vantage points. He had only ever used that knowledge to hide. Now, he would use it to hunt. Force is their language. We won't speak it. We'll use the terrain. We'll watch them. Learn their numbers, their routine. We strike when they don't expect it, how they don't expect it. His mind, which had been locked in a recursive loop of grief for years, was suddenly sharp, tactical. The fog of desolate guilt was clearing, replaced by the stark clarity of a single, galvanizing objective. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about reclamation, reclaiming Sarah's courage from the lie that had buried it, reclaiming his own life from the prison of his past. They spent the rest of the day in the cabin, a strange, unspoken partnership forming between them. As Eleanor rested and regained her strength, Thaddeus prepared. He sharpened his knife, checked his meager supplies, and moved around the small space with a quiet intensity. He felt a shift in his own body, a loosening of muscles that had been clenched for years, an awakening of senses that had been dulled by monotony. He was becoming the man he used to be, before grief had hollowed him out. He found himself watching her, the way her brow furrowed in thought, the determined set of her jaw even in exhaustion. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a soldier who had been temporarily sidelined. Her presence filled the cabin, pushing out the ghosts that had been his only companions. The silence between them was no longer the empty, oppressive silence of his solitude, but a shared, strategic quiet, pregnant with unspoken understanding. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, Eleanor pushed herself into a sitting position. "I'm ready," she said. Thaddeus looked at her, at the fresh bandage stark against her dusty clothes, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. He felt a tremor of something he couldn't name. It wasn't the shock of contact or the heat of rage. It was a fragile, terrifying sprout of trust. He was about to gamble his life, not just for a memory, but for this woman, this stranger who had shattered his world only to give him a reason to rebuild it. He had to choose right now between the familiar safety of running and the profound risk of trusting another person to fight alongside him. "All right," he said, and the word was a vow. "Their camp will be at the old loggers' clearing by the river. It's the only flat, defensible ground for miles. We'll move under the cover of darkness. We watch tonight. We act tomorrow." He handed her a strip of dried meat, and she took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. This time he didn't flinch. The contact was a simple, grounding fact, a current that flowed not from the past, but between the two of them, here in the present. The purpose that had been born in the cave now had a partner. His guilt had demanded isolation, but justice, he was beginning to realize, required an ally. The descent from the cabin was a journey through deepening shades of night. Thaddeus moved with the certainty of a creature born to the darkness. Eleanor, a half-step behind him, her hand often finding the back of his worn coat for balance. He led her along game trails and through thickets of pines so dense the moonlight couldn't penetrate, his knowledge of the mountain a living map in his mind. He was no longer hiding from the world. He was using its shadows as a weapon. They reached the ridge overlooking the old loggers' clearing an hour before midnight. Below them, a campfire burned, a single point of defiant orange in the vast, silver-washed darkness. It was just as he'd predicted. Figures moved around the flames, their silhouettes stark and menacing. He counted 4 men, plus the 2 from the forest. 6 in total. And a 7th, who sat on a log slightly apart from the others, his posture radiating an easy authority that could only belong to one man. Clayton Hayes. Even from this distance, Thaddeus recognized him. The broad shoulders, the confident stillness, the way the others deferred to him. 20 years had thickened his frame and salted his hair, but the predatory arrogance was unchanged. Seeing him was like staring at a physical manifestation of his own pain. The ghost was real, and he was sitting by a fire, drinking coffee, while Thaddeus had spent 2 decades shivering in a cell of his own making. A low growl rumbled in Thaddeus's chest, a sound more animal than human. Beside him, Eleanor drew a sharp breath. "That's him," she whispered, her voice laced with a venom that matched his own. "The pack is there. I can see it. By his feet." Thaddeus saw it too. Her leather saddle pack, lying casually in the dirt next to the outlaw leader. The container of truth. So close, yet impossibly far. 6 of them, Thaddeus murmured, his mind assessing, calculating. All armed. We'd be cut down before we got halfway to the fire. "Then we create a diversion," Eleanor countered, her fighting spirit undimmed. "Draw some of them away. I can handle a gun. Give me one and I'll—" "No!" Thaddeus cut her off, his voice firm. "They're expecting a direct assault. A fight. It's what they understand. It's a trap." He pointed to the edges of the clearing. In the deep shadows cast by the trees, he could just make out the glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel. Then another. They hadn't just made camp, they'd fortified it. Hayes was waiting for the helper he knew must exist. He was baiting a trap of his own. Eleanor fell silent, seeing the cold logic of his assessment. The sheer futility of a direct confrontation sank in, heavy and suffocating. She was ready to fight and die for her cause, but Thaddeus saw the flaw in that thinking. Dying was easy, winning was hard. "Brute force will fail," he said, his gaze locked on Hayes. "My whole life, my first instinct has been to run or to fight, to hide or to lash out. Both are forms of fear. I ran for 20 years. You want to fight?" Hayes is counting on one of those 2 reactions. He looked at her then, the moonlight catching the determined line of her jaw. "The real battle isn't for the pack. It's for his mind. We have to do something he can't predict, something that doesn't involve fists or bullets." The conflict was no longer about the 6 men in the camp. It was raging inside Thaddeus. Every instinct he possessed, every lesson learned from a hard life, told him that threats were met with violence. You don't reason with a wolf. You kill it. But he knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, that following that instinct would get them both killed. The old pattern. The failure. He had to let it go. He had to step out of the shadow of his past self and orchestrate a new kind of war. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thaddeus didn't answer immediately. He was watching Hayes. The way he laughed, a harsh, grating sound that carried on the night air. The way he gestured with his cup, confident and utterly in control. The man was a fortress of arrogance, and every fortress has a crack in its walls. For Hayes, the crack was his own history, his own crimes, the things he thought were long buried. "He's not afraid of a gun," Thaddeus said, thinking aloud. "He's lived by it his whole life, but what is he afraid of? A ghost. The past. He killed my wife to bury a secret. He killed your father to bury a secret. His entire life is built on the assumption that the dead stay dead and secrets stay buried." A plan began to form in his mind, audacious and terrifyingly fragile. It was a gamble of such immense proportions that his blood ran cold just thinking about it. It would require him to walk into the lion's den not with a sword, but with a story. "I'm going down there," he said. Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "Thaddeus, no. They'll kill you on sight. Not if they don't know who I am," he countered. "They're looking for a fighter, a rescuer. I'm going to give them a ghost." He turned to her, his face grim and resolute in the moonlight. "Your part in this is harder. You have to trust me. You have to stay here, stay hidden, no matter what you see or hear. You are the truth. You are the witness. If I fail, you are the one who gets away, who lives to tell the tale. Do you understand?" "Fail? Thaddeus, this is suicide," she insisted, grabbing his arm. The contact was fierce, pleading. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," he said, his voice gentle but absolute. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. "For 20 years, my guilt made me a coward. It made me believe that connection was a weakness, that it would only lead to more pain. But what you told me, It changed everything. My wife wasn't a victim of my cowardice. She was a hero. Her death wasn't my failure to protect her. It was his crime. He took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling his lungs. I'm not doing this out of guilt anymore, or for revenge. I'm doing this so the truth of her life and your father's isn't buried in that pack and burned in that fire. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, and I can't do it if I'm worried you're going to charge in behind me. I have to know you're safe. I have to trust you to stay put, just as you have to trust me to do whatever it is I'm about to do. The internal war was over. He had let go of the old patterns. He would not run. He would not fight with his fists. He would fight with the only weapon Hayes couldn't counter, the truth, or at least the ghost of it. He saw the struggle in Eleanor's face, the warrior's instinct warring with the nascent trust she had placed in this strange, haunted man. Finally, slowly, she released his arm. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice tight. "I'm going to give him what he fears most," Thaddeus said, his gaze returning to the firelight below. "Unfinished business." He gave her his knife. "If I'm not back by dawn, or if you hear a signal, 3 quick raven calls, you run. You don't look back. You get to the nearest town and you tell them everything. Promise me, Eleanor." She took the knife, her hand closing around the worn handle. Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded once, a sharp, final gesture. Then he turned and began to make his way down the treacherous slope, leaving her and the life he might have had with her in the shadows above. He was walking toward the fire, toward the man who had authored his pain, armed with nothing but a 20-year-old memory and a desperate, impossible bluff. He was no longer a hermit avoiding the world. He was a man walking willingly into its heart of darkness, hoping to find a flicker of light. He moved with a deliberate slowness, stepping out of the tree line and into the edges of the firelight. He didn't sneak. He walked as if he belonged there, his footfalls soft on the pine needles, but not silent. A sentry, the one whose rifle he'd spotted, stepped out from behind a tree, leveling the gun at his chest. "That's far enough, old man. State your business." Thaddeus stopped. He raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of calm. "My business is with Clayton Hayes," he said, his resurrected voice holding a strange, gravelly authority. The commotion drew the attention of the men by the fire. They scrambled to their feet, hands going to their guns. Hayes himself turned, his expression a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. He gestured for the sentry to bring the intruder forward. Thaddeus was marched into the center of the camp, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the cold knot of fear in his stomach. He was surrounded. 6 guns were trained on him. He kept his eyes locked on Hayes. Up close, the man's face was a roadmap of cruelty, his eyes small and calculating. "Well now," Hayes said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look what the cat dragged in. You the one who helped our little bird fly her coop?" Thaddeus ignored the question. He let his gaze drift from Hayes to the leather saddle pack on the ground. He held his stare for a long moment before returning it to Hayes's face. "You don't remember me," Thaddeus said. It wasn't a question. "But I remember you, from the Blackwood trial, and from the road near Willow Creek." A flicker of something, unease, confusion, crossed Hayes's face. The smirk tightened. "Old man, you're either brave or stupid. I meet a lot of people. You're going to have to be more specific." This was it, the precipice. Thaddeus took a breath and stepped off. "My wife's name was Sarah Crane," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence of the camp. "She told me things she found, things she was taking to Judge Blackwood before you stopped her." The air crackled with tension. The men looked from Thaddeus to Hayes, their postures tightening. Hayes's face, for the first time, lost its mask of casual arrogance. He stood up, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "You're lying," Hayes said, his voice a low threat. "She didn't tell anyone anything." "Didn't she?" Thaddeus pressed, taking a small, almost imperceptible step closer. He was gambling everything on a single, unprovable assertion. She told me about the ledgers, the ones detailing the cattle shipments you rerouted from the Miller Ranch. She told me about the names in it. O'Malley, the telegraph operator you paid off, and Finn, the stable boy you had silenced. Thaddeus was inventing names, details, weaving a tapestry of lies from the single thread of truth Eleanor had given him. He was watching Hayes's eyes, looking for the tell. For a moment, nothing. Hayes's face was a stone wall. Thaddeus's heart sank. It wasn't working. She told me where you kept them, Thaddeus said, playing his final desperate card. Not in a safe, not buried, too common. She said you hid them in plain sight, in the false bottom of the grain bin at your old homestead, under the oats. Hayes flinched. It was a minuscule reaction, a barely visible tightening around his eyes, but to Thaddeus, who was staking his life on it, it was a thunderclap. He'd guessed right, or close enough to be dangerous. You're the husband, Hayes breathed, a dark understanding dawning in his eyes. The one who ran, the one who disappeared. I heard you died up on that mountain. Ghosts have long memories, Hayes, Thaddeus said, pressing his advantage. Those papers in that pack are just confirmation, the real evidence. The real evidence is right here. He tapped his temple. Everything she told me, every name, every date, every crime, it's all been waiting. For 20 years. This was the core of the bluff. He was making himself the target. He was claiming to be the living ledger, rendering the papers in the pack secondary. He was forcing Hayes to focus all his fear, all his murderous rage, onto him. He was drawing the fire. Hayes let out a short, ugly laugh, but it was brittle, unconvincing. You think you can walk in here, spin some fairy tale, and walk out? He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the clearing. I'll just do to you what I should have done 20 years ago. Go ahead, Thaddeus said, his voice steady despite the hammer beat of his heart. Kill me. But my story doesn't die with me. Before I came down here, I made arrangements. The full account, everything Sarah told me, is with a friend. If I don't return by morning, it goes straight to the federal marshal in Fort James. Killing me now is the worst thing you could do. It's my insurance. He held Hayes's gaze. A silent battle of wills waged across the 6 feet of firelit dirt that separated them. He could feel the outlaw's mind churning, caught between the instinct to kill and the poison of doubt Thaddeus had so carefully injected. This was Eleanor's cue. The chaos he had created was her cover. From the ridge above, a single sharp raven's caw cut through the night. Then another, and a third. The signal. But it wasn't the signal to run. It was the signal to act. As Hayes and his men instinctively glanced up toward the sound, a rifle shot cracked from the darkness of the ridge. It wasn't aimed at a man. It splintered the handle of the coffee pot sitting on the fire's grate, sending scalding liquid and hot embers hissing across the ground. Chaos erupted. The men scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the trees. "It's an ambush!" one of them yelled. In that split second of confusion, Thaddeus moved. He lunged forward, not at Hayes, but at the saddle pack. He scooped it off the ground as Hayes, momentarily distracted, turned to fire his pistol toward the ridge. It was a dance of trust, perfectly executed. He had drawn their attention, and Eleanor had provided the diversion. He had the pack. He turned to run, but one of the thugs was faster, tackling him at the knees. He went down hard, the wind knocked out of him, but he held onto the pack with a death grip. The man raised the butt of his rifle to bring it down on Thaddeus's head. Before the blow could land, a second shot rang out from the ridge. The man grunted and collapsed, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Eleanor was not just a diversion. She was a guardian angel with a rifle. Thaddeus scrambled to his feet, the pack clutched to his chest. Hayes was screaming orders, his plans unraveling into a frantic firefight against a ghost on a hill. "Forget the shooter! Get him! Get the pack!" Thaddeus didn't run back the way he came. He ran toward the river, toward the dark, churning water, the one direction they wouldn't expect. He crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face. A bullet sang past his ear. He could hear them crashing through the woods behind him. He reached the riverbank, the water a black, rushing torrent. There was no bridge, no escape. He was trapped. He turned, his back to the cold water, as Hayes and 3 of his men burst through the trees, their guns leveled. "Nowhere left to run, old man," Hayes snarled, his face contorted with fury. "Give me the pack." Thaddeus held the pack over the rushing water. "It's over, Hayes. The papers are just paper. You heard me. I'm the witness." "You're a dead man!" Hayes shouted. "I burned the real ledgers years ago. Whatever's in that pack is just notes, inadmissible. But your story—" He took a step closer. "Your story is dangerous." A voice cut through the standoff, sharp and clear from the woods behind Hayes's men. "His story is true, and you just confessed to destroying evidence." 2 figures stepped out of the shadows, rifles held steady. It was the 2 men from the initial search, the ones Thaddeus had assumed were long gone. But their rifles weren't aimed at Thaddeus. They were aimed at Hayes. The taller of the 2 men spoke again, his voice cold and official. "Clayton Hayes, you're under arrest. We're deputies with the U.S. Marshals." Hayes froze, his face a mask of disbelief. He slowly turned to see the 2 men he thought were his own, now holding him at gunpoint. Eleanor's plan hadn't just been to use herself as bait for Hayes. She had contacted the Marshals beforehand, telling them her plan, letting them insert their own men into Hayes's gang. The whole thing, from the moment she was tied to that tree, had been a trap far more intricate than Hayes could ever have conceived. The men she'd shot from the ridge had been a calculated risk, their wounds non-fatal, a necessary part of the performance. Hayes, cornered and betrayed, let out a roar of pure rage and lunged, not at the Marshals, but at Thaddeus. He didn't care about the pack anymore. He wanted to silence the ghost. But Thaddeus was no longer a ghost. He was solid. He was present. He didn't retreat. He stood his ground, and as Hayes crashed into him, he used the man's own momentum, stepping aside and sending the outlaw stumbling past him, his arms flailing, right into the icy, churning river. The current caught him instantly, dragging him under. He surfaced, sputtering, his surprise turning to panic as the cold water sapped his strength. The Marshals rushed to the riverbank, ready to haul him out. He would not escape justice by drowning. He would be brought in, alive, to face the weight of his crimes. Thaddeus stood on the bank, breathing heavily, the precious saddle pack still clutched in his hand. Across the clearing, Eleanor emerged from the trees, her rifle held loosely at her side. Her face was grim, but her eyes, when they met his, were filled with a light that spoke of vindicated trust. He had walked into the fire for her, and she had been his salvation from the ridge. It hadn't been a vengeful killing. It had been a capture, a victory of strategy over brute force, of trust over isolation. The weight of 20 years, the crushing burden of a past he could never outrun, finally, blessedly, began to lift. The aftermath was a quiet affair. Clayton Hayes, sputtering and shivering, was hauled from the river by the Marshals and bound. His captured men, nursing their wounds and their pride, were rounded up. The night, which had exploded in gunfire and confrontation, settled back into a watchful silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying campfire and the low murmur of the lawmen. Eleanor approached Thaddeus, her limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline had faded. She stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face in the flickering firelight. He held out the saddle pack. His arm ached, his body was bruised, but he felt more whole than he had in 2 decades. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice steady. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact was warm, solid, a promise. "It's ours," she corrected him softly. "We did this, together." The word "we" hung in the air between them, a foreign and beautiful sound. Thaddeus looked away from her intense gaze toward the defeated figure of Hayes being led away. There was no triumph in the sight, no savage glee. just a profound, quiet sense of closure. The ghost that had haunted him for 20 years was finally just a man, cold and pathetic, stripped of his power. The past was no longer a predator. It was just a story, and its final chapter had just been written. One of the marshals, a stern man with a weathered face, came over to them. "Ma'am," he said to Eleanor, "we can't thank you enough. Your plan was risky, but it paid off. We've been after Hayes for years." He then turned to Thaddeus. "And you, sir. I don't know who you are, but you've got more nerve than a company of soldiers. We'll need your testimony, both of you. We'll be heading back to Fort James at first light." The future, which for 20 years had been an endless expanse of identical gray days, suddenly presented him with a crossroads. Fort James, the world of men and laws, of towns and streets. And then what? Return to his mountain? To the crushing silence and the empty cabin that had been his prison? The thought, which once would have been a comfort, now felt like a death sentence. The isolation he had cultivated as a shield now seemed like just another wall. He looked at Eleanor. She was watching him, her expression unreadable but patient. She wasn't pushing, wasn't asking. She was simply letting him choose. He could go back to being a ghost, or he could take the first, terrifying step toward being a man again. "I'll be there," Thaddeus said to the marshal. It was a simple statement, but it felt like the most significant decision of his life. They spent the rest of the night by the fire, a strange island of quiet in the official proceedings of the marshals. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in action and trust. He watched her as she carefully went through the contents of the pack, her father's notes and the ledgers Sarah had died for, finally safe. She handled them with a reverent sadness, the culmination of her long and dangerous quest. When the first pale fingers of dawn touched the sky, casting the pine trees in stark relief, the marshals were ready to move out. Thaddeus stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back up the slope in the direction of his cabin. It was up there, hidden in the mist, a monument to his grief. He had everything he needed there to survive, but he realized, with a clarity that was sharp and painful, that there was nothing there to help him live. "Are you coming?" Eleanor's voice was soft beside him. He turned to face her. The rising sun caught the streaks of exhaustion under her eyes, but it also illuminated the fierce, unbreakable strength that had called to him from the oak tree. He saw a future in her face, not one of grand passion or storybook romance, but something quieter, deeper, and more real, a partnership, a shared project of healing and building. "I have nothing to go back to," he said, and the words were true. His penance was over. The guilt had been lifted. The mountain was just a mountain again, a place of rock and trees, no longer a prison for his soul. He walked with her, away from the clearing, away from the mountain, falling into step beside the marshals and their prisoners. The journey to Fort James took 2 days, and with every step that took him further from his isolation, Thaddeus felt the weight of the past receding, replaced by the uncertain but hopeful terrain of the present. The trial was a formality. With the evidence from the pack and the damning testimony of Thaddeus and the undercover marshals, Clayton Hayes was condemned. Justice, slow and long overdue, was served. Thaddeus stood in the courtroom, a man blinking in the unfamiliar light of civilization, and spoke Sarah's name aloud, not as a whisper of guilt, but as a declaration of her courage. He was giving her the ending she deserved. When it was all over, he found himself adrift. The town was loud, chaotic, a world he no longer knew how to navigate. He had a choice to make. He could take the money he was owed as a witness and disappear, find another mountain, another solitary place to live out his days in peace. Or he could stay. He found Eleanor on the edge of town, looking out over the rolling plains that stretched to the horizon. She had a small inheritance from her father, a piece of land just outside of town, enough to start over. "What will you do now?" she asked, without looking at him. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I haven't had to think about now for a long time. There's land," she said, her voice quiet. Work to be done, a house to build. She finally turned to him, and her eyes held a simple, profound invitation. A home isn't something you find. It's something you build, one splinter and scar at a time. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, but no longer foreign. They were the hands of a man who could build things. He thought of the cold, silent cabin on the mountain, a place built from grief, and he thought of what it might be like to build a place from hope. He chose to stay. Their life together was not a whirlwind of passion. It was a slow, quiet construction. They built a small house on her land, their days filled with the clean scent of fresh-cut lumber and the satisfying rhythm of shared labor. He taught her the ways of the wilderness, and she taught him the ways of the world again. They were two solitary people learning the language of companionship. Their evenings were spent by the hearth of a fireplace they had built together, stone by stone. Often, they sat in a comfortable silence, the quiet between them no longer a sign of isolation, but of deep, unspoken understanding. It was a home built not on a foundation of grand declarations, but of small, steady moments of trust. One evening, months later, as a cool autumn wind whispered outside, he was mending a piece of tack by the fire. Eleanor came and sat on the floor beside his chair, reading a book. Without thinking, he reached out and rested his hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She simply leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acceptance and peace. The contact was not a shock, not a memory, not a jolt of electricity. It was just warmth, simple, grounding, and real. He looked at the fire, at the sturdy walls of the home they had made, at the woman beside him, who had pulled him back into the world of the living. The ghost of Thaddeus Crane was finally gone, replaced by a man who had confronted his past and, in the process, had built himself a future. He had learned that true safety wasn't in the solitude of a mountain prison, but in the quiet courage of a shared hearth, in the hard-earned peace of a hand resting gently on a shoulder, a home he had not found, but built. And it was enough.